My husband left me and our newborn for another woman, then his mother showed up blaming me and tried to take my kids. So I collected evidence, fought her in court, won custody, and exposed them. The moment Diane Caldwell's eyes landed on the empty frame, I watched her decide whose fault this was. She hadn't even taken her coat off yet. I was standing in the middle of my own living room, Milo teething on my shoulder, Ruby pressing her blocks into my ankle formula on my sleeve, and 3 days of bad sleep behind my eyes. And I watched this woman in a camel coat and pearl earrings do the math on my life and come up with the wrong answer in about 4 seconds flat. Her gaze moved from the pile of unopened mail by the door to the laundry at the foot of the stairs to the empty rectangle on the bookshelf where Eric's and my wedding photo used to be. And something behind her eyes went from concern to assessment to verdict so fast I almost missed the transition. Almost. "Why is that frame empty?" she asked. And that was the moment I understood that the next several months of my life were going to be a war and that I was going to have to win it while also keeping 2 children alive, functional and emotionally intact with a teething infant on my hip and no one on my side. I had been underestimated my entire marriage. That was about to become my greatest advantage. Let me tell you who I am because it matters. My name is Nora Caldweller, or I was Nora Caldwell for 7 years, and I'm in the process of figuring out which version of that name I want to keep. I'm 34. I have a master's degree in public health that I put on hold when Ruby was born because the childcare math didn't work and Eric's income was sufficient, and we agreed together that this made sense. Ruby is 4 now. Milo is 8 months old. For 3 years, I have been the person who manages this household. Every appointment, every grocery run, every pediatric visit, every night feeding, every developmental milestone logged in a baby app that Eric occasionally asked me to summarize for him because he didn't want to read through it himself. I am not a passive person. I am not someone who drifts. I made a deliberate choice to be present for my children, and I made it eyes open, and I will defend that choice to anyone who suggests it made me lesser. Eric Caldwell is 37, civil litigation attorney, junior partner at Esterbrook and Howell in Columbus. Blonde, handsome in the way that photographs well and reveals nothing. In the early years, he was attentive and warm and genuinely funny. And I loved him in the way you love someone when you're 26, and the world still feels like it will cooperate with your plans. Then Ruby was born, and the balance shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way water erodes something slowly, invisibly, until one day, the structure is just gone. He started working late in early 2023. I noticed it the way you notice weather as a shift in atmosphere before you can name what's changing. He stopped asking about my day. He started taking calls in the backyard. He traveled for depositions in cities I'd never heard him mention as relevant to any case. I told myself it was stress. The firm was pushing him toward partnership. The billing targets were brutal. He was carrying a lot. I told myself a lot of things. The text came on a Tuesday night in September while Milo was 3 weeks old and I had been awake for most of the previous 72 hours. Eric had gone for a walk after dinner. "I just need air. I've been inside all day." And I was feeding Milo on the couch when his phone buzzed on the coffee table and I saw a name I didn't recognize. Kelsey, just the name. And the first 2 words of the message before the screen locked. I miss. I put the phone face down. I looked at Milo. I finished the feeding. I put him in the bassinet and I sat on the couch in the dark and I breathed very carefully for a long time because I had a newborn baby and a 3-year-old asleep upstairs and I could not afford to stop functioning. He came home an hour later smelling like fresh air and someone else's perfume. I said nothing. I started building the folder the next morning. I need to tell you about the folder because it's the center of everything. I am by training a public health researcher. I know how to document. I know what evidence looks like and how it needs to be organized to be useful to someone other than me. So when I started to understand what was happening in my marriage, I did not spiral. I did not confront. I did not send the tearful 2 a.m. text demanding to know who Kelsey was. I documented cell phone records. I had access to our shared plan through the Verizon account, and I downloaded 6 months of logs. Kelsey Marsh's number appeared first in April. By August, she was getting more minutes than I was. By September, the month Milo was born, there were 4,200 minutes of outgoing calls to her number. Credit card statements. I had access to our joint AMX for household expenses, and I went back 12 months. Restaurants I hadn't been to, hotels and cities during depositions, jewelry from a store downtown that was not something I owned. I cataloged everything in a Google Sheet with dates, amounts, and columns for corroborating information. Text screenshots, not his phone, which I didn't touch, but mine. Every time he texted me something about his schedule that I later found contradicted by the credit card records. Staying late at the office tonight on a date when the AMX showed a reservation at a restaurant 40 minutes from the office at 7:30 p.m. I labeled the folder medical records. I kept it on a Google Drive account he didn't know about. I backed it up to a thumb drive I kept in a tampon box in the bathroom cabinet. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds paranoid and cold and premeditated, but I had a newborn and a toddler, and I was sleep-deprived to the point of hallucination. And I understood in whatever functioning part of my brain was still operating clearly, that if I was right about what was happening, I was going to need to have been building this for months, not starting from scratch after the explosion. I was right. He left on the second Tuesday of October. He waited until Ruby was at preschool and Milo was napping. He packed 2 bags with the quiet efficiency of someone who had planned the logistics in advance. He put his car key and house key on the kitchen counter. He sat down across from me at the table and said that he deserved happiness and that the marriage had become too stressful and that I would be fine because I was stronger than he was. I sat across from him and held Milo and didn't cry. He left at 10:47 a.m. I watched his Audi pull out of the driveway from the kitchen window. Then I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. Her name was Patricia Gomez. 17 years in family law. 8 of them focused on complex asset division and custody disputes in Franklin County. She had short hair and reading glasses. She pushed up like a headband and a way of listening that made you feel as though she had already anticipated everything you were about to say and had a response prepared. I had called her for the first time 3 weeks earlier before Eric left when I was still in the documentation phase, and she had listened to 40 minutes of my organized sourced time-stamped account without interrupting, and then said, "File first." The parent who establishes the framework controls the narrative. I filed for temporary primary custody and child support on October 16th. Eric was served on October 21st. He called me 11 times between 4 and 6:30 p.m. that day. I let every call go to voicemail and texted Patricia the call log. Then I went to Ruby's preschool pickup, came home, made dinner, did bath time, put both kids to bed, and ate a bowl of cereal standing at the counter at 8:45 p.m. While going through the custody petition line by line. I had not told anyone in the family, not Eric's parents, not my own, not a mutual friend. I kept the circle to Patricia and to my sister Jen, who lived in Cincinnati, and who I called after the kids were asleep and who listened without advice and with the specific silence of someone who loves you enough not to say "I told you so." So when Diane Caldwell appeared on my porch 4 days after Eric was served color-coded snacks, pearl earrings, camel coat, and all that manufactured warmth, she was walking into a situation she knew nothing about, and I could see the exact moment she found out. Eric moved out. I said 3 weeks ago. I watched the information move through her. Diane Caldwell is 61 years old. She is the kind of woman who makes everything look controlled. Controlled home, controlled clothing, controlled emotional register. She has never in the 7 years I have known her expressed distress. She expresses concern, which is distress translated into a language that keeps her in authority. The concern flickered across her face. Then something else came behind it. I handed her the text, the one Eric had sent me the night he left. I'd had it printed because Patricia had suggested I keep physical copies of the primary documents. And because part of me had known this moment was coming and had wanted to be ready for it, she read it once, twice. Then she looked at me and I saw something I had not expected and will never forget. The anger in her eyes was not for her son. It was for me. "You must have driven him to this," she said. I'd expected shock, grief, maybe even neutrality. I had not expected that sentence out of a woman looking at proof of her son's abandonment of a woman and 2 children, one of them 8 weeks old. But there it was. She started pacing. The room became, in her description, a disaster, which it was, the functional disaster of a home with a teething infant and a preschooler and no second adult, which is different from neglect in the way that a battlefield is different from a garden, and calling one the other says something about your priorities. She said, "Plenty of women manage," she said. "No wonder he needed distance," I said, "with a husband." She told me to mind my tone. Then she stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as calculating. "Where is he staying?" "Across town," I said, "with Kelsey." Her face did something complicated. Who is Kelsey, the woman he left us for? The denial was swift and certain. She shook her head before I finished the sentence, and what followed was a small lecture about men under pressure and wives who stopped meeting them there. And her eyes moved over me while she talked in a way that felt like an inspection and was meant to. The collapsed bun, the formula on the sleeve, the tired face. She was scoring me on something, and I was failing. I felt my jaw tighten. "You're not going to insult me in my own home," I said. She scoffed. "Your home, Eric, covers everything." It wasn't even true. I had brought in $48,000 freelancing in public health consulting work over the previous 18 months during pregnancy and newborn care and preschool drop-offs. Patricia had the records, but that's beside the point. The point was that Diane had already received a version of our marriage that cast Eric as the load-bearing wall and me as a tenant who had let the place go. He had been building his defense for months, maybe longer. Then she stepped forward and the quality of the room changed. "Let me take the children," she said. Ruby pressed herself hard into my leg without a word. Children understand things before they have language for them. She pressed into my leg and went completely still. "No. I said you're emotional. You need time to think. I'm their mother. If you cooperate," she said, and her voice dropped into something smooth and private. The voice of someone who conducts negotiations in rooms without witnesses. "We can resolve this quietly." That word, quietly. It is the most dangerous word in the English language when spoken by someone protecting an institution. I pulled out my phone. "Go ahead," I said. "Call him." She was already scrolling to his contact. Her thumb hovered. "Because I already called my lawyer," I said. "I filed for temporary custody last week. Child support petition attached. Eric was served yesterday." The stillness that came over her face was not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of someone recalculating. Someone who has just discovered the board is not arranged the way they thought it was. Her jaw tightened. "Eric was served yesterday," she said carefully. "At 2:17 p.m., I said at his office. Patricia Gomes sent the process server. It's all on file with the Franklin County Court." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she called Eric. He arrived 12 minutes later, wrinkled shirt jaw unshaved. The look of a man who had spent 4 days believing he had the upper hand and was now walking into a situation that suggested otherwise. He came through the door and saw Ruby, who looked at him with the unblinking focused children reserved for adults who have confused them. Saw Milo in his bouncer, saw his mother standing rigid in the center of the room. Then he saw me standing between my children and both of them. Which is the only place I had been for 3 weeks and intended to stay. "You filed papers," he said. "You left. I needed you moved in with another woman." Diane stepped in. "Eric, take the children to my house right now." "No," I said. His voice went hard. "They're my kids. Then act like it." The silence that followed was the particular silence of something true landing in a room full of people who can't argue with it. Ruby looked up at her father. Her expression was the expression of a 4-year-old who has been trying to understand something for 3 weeks and has not succeeded. "Daddy," she said, "are you coming back home?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Not because he was overwhelmed with emotion. I want to be honest about this, but because he was calculating the way he always did and there was no good calculation available. Ruby pressed her face into my side. That silence did more than everything else in the room combined. Eric looked at his mother, at me, at the empty frame. Something moved through his face I hadn't seen in years. Something that might have been shame or might have just been the recognition that certain performances had stopped working. "Not now, Mom," he said. "Eric," I said, "not now." Diane looked at her son as though he had said something in a language she didn't speak, the script she had been running for 30 years. Walk in, take control, resolve, quietly protect the name had been handed back to her, and she didn't know where to put it. She looked at me one long, cold measurement, then she left. The door closed with a soft click that was somehow worse than a slam. Eric stood in the middle of the home he had abandoned, and his phone buzzed on his hip. He glanced at the screen, and something I had never seen on his face appeared in full. Not guilt, not shame, panic. He turned the screen to his chest before I could read it. And I thought, whatever Diane just said in motion, we haven't seen the beginning of it yet. I was right. The campaign started 48 hours later. I found out about it from my neighbor, Kathy Rollins, whose daughter was in Ruby's preschool class and whose husband played golf with a man who worked with Eric's father. Small city, short distances between information and consequence. Diane had called 4 people within the first 24 hours of leaving my house. Her pastor, the chair of the school fundraising committee she co-chaired with a family law mediator named Glenn Hartley, her closest friend who happened to be on the Worthington Parent-Teacher Organization board, and most strategically a family therapist named Dr. Carol Whitfield, who had treated Eric briefly for work stress in 2021, and who had met me exactly once at a dinner party. The message, as it was relayed to me through Kathy in pieces over 3 days, was a work of careful construction. I had become unstable since Milo's birth. I wasn't coping. The house was in a worrying state. Diane was concerned and had simply dropped by to check in. Eric was understandably in a difficult position. They were all hoping for a quiet resolution. She had not mentioned Kelsey once. I called Patricia at 7:15 a.m. on Thursday. Kids still asleep. She's doing a soft reputation campaign, Patricia said with the calm of someone who has seen this many times. Preemptive. She's trying to establish an incompetency narrative before we get anywhere near a courtroom. Can she? She can try. Here's what we're going to do. We moved fast. Step 1. Patricia requested a guardian ad litem be appointed for Ruby and Milo. A gal is an independent attorney who represents the children's interests exclusively. Not mine, not Eric's, not the Caldwell family's. Their name was Kevin Park. 12 years in family law with a reputation Patricia described as relentlessly fair, which in a case like this means he'll follow the evidence. Step 2. I called my pediatrician, Dr. Amara Singh, and scheduled wellness visits for both children with explicit documentation requested. Ruby and Milo were healthy, developing normally, and Dr. Singh had seen them consistently every 6 to 8 weeks. Her records would show it. At the appointment on Friday, Dr. Singh walked into the exam room, saw my face, and said, "How long has it been since you slept?" "Weeks," I said. She looked at Ruby, who was organizing the tongue depressors into a color-coded line on the exam table, and at Milo, who was watching the ceiling fan with the profound focus babies give to ceiling fans. "These children are healthy and clearly loved," she said. She said it directly, carefully, in the way of someone choosing words for the record. She made a note in the chart. I asked her to document her observations about the home environment at our visits. She nodded without asking me to explain why. Step 3. The evidence package. Patricia had been cataloging the folder I'd sent her for weeks. The call logs, the AMX statements, the hotel receipts, the jewelry purchase. She had subpoenaed Eric's firm credit card records through our preliminary financial disclosure and found 11 additional transactions. Meals, hotel rooms, one florist charge that corresponded with times he had told me he was working. The Kelsey file was substantial. On October 30th, Patricia filed Exhibit C with our motion for temporary orders, a 61-page documentation package containing phone records, financial records, time-stamped correspondence, and a declaration from me, covering the timeline of the marriage's deterioration with specific reference to the documented infidelity. Eric's attorney, a man named Todd Rearan, who had been in family law for 23 years and whose approach Patricia described as theatrical, filed a response 3 days later claiming I was emotionally volatile and had created a chaotic home environment. He cited as his primary exhibit a photograph. I stared at the photograph for a long time. It was a picture of my living room taken through the window from outside my house. Toys everywhere. Laundry on the couch, unopened mail. It was a competent photograph of a home with 2 young children and no second adult taken, I calculated from the light, approximately 48 hours after Eric had served and Diane had appeared on my porch. Someone had stood on my lawn and photographed my living room through my window. My hands went cold. I called Patricia. "That photograph was taken without your consent from private property," she said before I finished explaining. "That's relevant. More importantly, who took it? I had a neighbor camera, a Ring doorbell with a wide field of view I'd had installed the previous spring, which Eric had called paranoid and I had called practical. The footage covered my front porch and most of my front path. I pulled it up on my phone. October 23rd. 2:34 p.m. Diane Caldwell walking along the exterior of my house, pausing at the living room window, raising her phone. I sat with that for 10 seconds. Then I called Patricia back. "I have her on camera," I said. The silence on the other end of the line was the particular silence of an attorney who has just been handed something useful. "Send it to me immediately," she said. "Don't tell anyone. Not Eric, not your sister. No one already sent." Kevin Park, the Guardian ad litem, interviewed me on November 8th in Patricia's conference room. He was methodical and even-voiced and asked questions that covered everything from my daily routine with the children, to my support network, to my plans for returning to work, to my relationship with Eric's family. He asked about Diane's visit specifically. I described it accurately. I produced my notes from that day. I'd written them up within an hour of her leaving, as Patricia had instructed me to do from the beginning. Timestamps direct quote Subi's behavior. Milo's state the request to take the children. The word quietly. Kevin Park wrote without expression. Then he asked, in your judgment, what is Mrs. Caldwell's primary motivation in this matter? Control of the narrative. I said, see. She wants what happened contained within the family before it touches Eric's professional reputation or the Caldwell name. He looked up. Specifically, I said she doesn't want anyone to know that her son left a woman with an 8-week-old baby to move in with someone he'd been seeing for at least 6 months. He wrote that down too. He interviewed Eric and Diane separately over the following week. I was not told what was said. Patricia told me not to speculate. I didn't speculate, I prepared. The crisis I hadn't seen coming arrived on November 14th. It came in the form of a certified letter from a family court mediation service requested by Eric's attorney proposing an emergency custody evaluation by a third-party psychologist. The evaluation was framed as in the best interest of the children and requested both parents' participation within 5 business days. The psychologist they named was Dr. Martin Doyle. I stared at the name for a while, then called Patricia. He's Diane's therapist's husband, Patricia said. I had it flagged 30 seconds after the letter came in. Can they do that? They attempted it. We're filing a conflict of interest objection this afternoon. Kevin Park has already been notified. She paused. They're getting nervous. This is what nervous looks like. The objection was filed at Forsyth. The proposed evaluator was rejected by the court on November 17th as a result of the documented conflict. Todd Rearan filed a formal complaint against Patricia, which was reviewed and dismissed in 6 days, and then Kevin Park submitted his preliminary recommendation to the court. I got a call from Patricia at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. He recommended primary residential custody to you, she said. Standard visitation for Eric child support calculated on his income at the firm. And she paused. He flagged for the court's consideration that Mrs. Diane Caldwell's conduct, including the unauthorized photography and the unannounced home access, represented a potential boundary issue that should be addressed in the final parenting plan. I was sitting on the kitchen floor because that's where I'd ended up when she called with my back against the cabinet, Milo asleep upstairs, and Ruby in the bath running out of hot water. He flagged Diane, I said by name. In the record, I put my head back against the cabinet and looked at the ceiling. Ruby called out from the bathroom. Mama, the water is cold. Coming, baby, I called back. I stood up. I went down the hall. I managed bath time and pajamas and 2 bedtime stories and both kids asleep by 8:30. And then I sat on the edge of my bed in the quiet and I let myself feel the full weight of 6 weeks of organized, relentless, exhausted warfare on behalf of my children. I didn't cry, but it was close. The settlement conference was December 3rd. Patricia and I arrived at 9 a.m. Eric and Todd Rearan arrived at 9:07. Diane was not present, and per the parenting plan terms, Patricia had requested would not be relevant to any discussions without both parties' consent. We were in separate rooms for most of it, which is how these things work. A mediator named Frank Wong, 26 years in family court, the face of a man who has witnessed most of the ways human beings fail each other and has learned to work around all of them, moved between the rooms for 4 hours. Eric's counteroffer was joint physical custody week on week off. No child support on the basis that costs would equalize. Kelsey's presence in his home was characterized as not a factor. My position per Patricia's guidance was grounded in evidence and specificity. Ruby's school and pediatric records were all based in my address. Milo's medical history, all primary care, all emergency care, was documented under my address and my coordination. Eric had attended 9 medical appointments in 2 years of Ruby's life and 0 of Milo's. I had a spreadsheet. I had the chart records. I had the call log showing who had coordinated with the school, the pediatrician, the preschool wait list. Frank Wong came back from Eric's room at 2:17 p.m. and sat across from me. He's prepared to agree to primary residential with you, he said. Standard parenting time on his end. Alternating weekends 1 evening, midweek. Child support at the calculated guideline amount. I looked at Patricia. She looked at me. What about Kelsey? I said. Wong nodded. He's agreed to a 90-day introduction period before any romantic partner is introduced to the children. That goes for both parties and Diane. Wang's expression shifted minimally. He's agreed that extended family access to the children is subject to your mutual consent during his parenting time, and that unsolicited contact with your home or your child's school by third parties is prohibited and constitutes a parenting plan violation. He didn't say Diane's name. He didn't have to. I sat with it. Yes, I said, we accept. Eric and I signed the parenting plan on December 10th. Patricia sent me a copy by email at 4:33 p.m. I saved it in a folder I labeled without ceremony. Done. Then I picked Ruby up from preschool, which she now attended 5 mornings a week on a schedule that had not changed since October. Because her routine had not changed since October, because some things I had managed to hold absolutely still while everything else moved. She ran to me at the door with the full body abandon of 4-year-olds who have not yet learned to restrain joy. And she grabbed my hand and said, "Mama, we made a gingerbread house and mine fell down and Mrs. Peterson helped me glue it back together." "Did it work?" I said, boastfully. She said, "One wall kept falling, but it's okay because you can't see it from the front." I held her hand and walked her to the car and got Milo's car seat strapped in and looked at my children in the rearview mirror. Ruby narrating the structural failures of her gingerbread house in detail. Milo watching the world go by with his particular serene intensity. And I thought about walls that keep falling and the things you build. Anyway, 3 months later, Diane Caldwell called me. I almost didn't answer. I was at the kitchen table with coffee, a Tuesday morning, kids at school, and daycare. A consulting project open on my laptop, the familiar name on the screen. I let it ring twice. Then I answered Nora. Her voice sounded older, not much, but enough to notice. I've been meaning to a pause. The most uncharacteristic pause I had ever heard from a woman who did not leave spaces in her sentences. I was wrong about what I said that day. I did not feel the silence for her. "I shouldn't have suggested you drove him to it," she said. "That was wrong." I looked at my coffee. "Thank you," I said. "That means something. I meant it. Not enough and too late and partial in the way that acknowledgments from people who've chosen badly always are. But something." "The children," she said carefully. "I'd like to see them. Talk to Eric." I said, "The schedule is in the parenting plan. It goes through him. Quiet on the line." "Okay," she said. "Okay," I said. I hung up. I sat with the phone for a moment. Then I opened the consulting project and got back to work because Ruby had a dentist appointment at 3:45 and Milo had a well visit at the end of the month, and there was dinner to think about and a school project due Friday and a life to continue building. The gingerbread wall had fallen. I'd glued it back together. You couldn't see the damage from the front.